The fever came to Willow Creek on the back of an orphan train, and by the time the church bell tolled its warning across the Colorado high country in the autumn of 1878, half the wagons camped along Willow Creek's southern bend were already burning with sickness no doctor within 50 miles knew how to stop. Theodora Bristol heard the bell from the porch of her father's old house, the house that still smelled of carbolic soap and dried lavender, though he had been 6 months in the ground. She counted the tolls without meaning to, an old habit from childhood, and when the ringing did not stop at the usual count for a death, but kept going, frantic and uneven, she knew something had gone terribly wrong down at the camp. By nightfall, the whole town understood. Diphtheria had swept through the orphan train's youngest passengers, then leapt like a spark in dry grass to the families who had taken in the wagons for the night, then to the miners' children who had gone down to trade marbles and buttons with the newcomers. Within 3 days, the camp beside the creek held more than 30 children coughing behind a membrane closing their throats, and grown men and women who had once called themselves neighbors were nailing boards across their own doors to keep the sickness out. The town council met in the back room of the Mercantile and voted, 17-2, to quarantine the camp entirely. No food would be sent, no water hauled, no doctor, because there was no doctor left in Willow Creek to send. The only physician, an aging man named Dr. Whitfield, had already fallen ill tending the first cases and lay dying in his own bed. The council called it prudence. Theodora Bristol, standing in the doorway with her father's leather medical bag still packed from years of riding beside him on his rounds, called it something else, though she did not say the word aloud in that room, because she understood already that no argument would move men who were afraid. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and had spent the better part of her life apprenticed to a man who believed medicine was a duty owed to whoever needed it, not a luxury sold to whoever could pay for it. Her father, Dr. Elias Bristow, had ridden through blizzards and Comanche raids and cholera summers to reach patients other doctors would not touch, and he had taught his only daughter to set bones, to lance abscesses, to recognize the gray membrane of diphtheria closing a child's airway, and most of all, to never once ask whether a life was worth saving before she tried to save it. When the council finished its vote, Theodora rode home, packed her father's bag with what medicine remained in his cabinet, saddled the gray mare he had left her, and told no one where she was going, because she suspected, rightly, that someone would try to stop her. She rode out at first light the next morning, alone, toward the fever camp that the rest of Willow Creek had already decided to let die. The camp sat in a shallow bowl of land where the creek bent west before straightening out again toward the mountains, a place that had seemed pleasant enough when the orphan train stopped there to rest its horses. Now it looked like something out of a nightmare told to frighten children into obedience. Canvas tents sagged gray and damp in the cold morning air. Smoke curled thin and sour from a few dying fires. And everywhere Theodora looked, she saw small shapes lying still beneath blankets too thin for the season, and larger shapes, the few adults who had not yet fled or fallen sick themselves, moving between them with the slow, hopeless motions of people who had already given up. She dismounted at the edge of the camp, tied her mare to a wagon wheel, and walked forward with her bag in one hand and her chin lifted, because her father had taught her that fear was contagious too, and a physician who let her show did more harm than good. "You should not have come," said the first adult to notice her, a gaunt woman with a soot-streaked apron who Theodora would later learn was named Sarah Voss, one of the orphan train's 2 remaining escorts. "There is nothing here but dying, Miss Bristol. Go home." "I am not going home," Theodora said, and knelt beside the nearest child, a boy of perhaps 7 with lips gone faintly blue and a rattle in his breathing that she recognized immediately, with a cold drop in her stomach, as the sound her father had once described to her as the sound of a child running out of time. She worked through that first day without stopping, because there was no one else to do the work, and because stopping meant thinking about how impossible the task truly was. She swabbed throats with a mixture of vinegar and honey her father had sworn by for loosening the diphtheria membrane. She propped children upright to ease their breathing. She boiled what water she could find over the camp's dying fires and made the healthier children drink it, warning them, though she doubted they understood, that the creek water itself might be carrying the sickness from tent to tent. By the time the light went gold and long across the mountains, she had lost her first patient, a girl no older than 4, and she had wept for exactly as long as it took to close the child's eyes and wrap her in a blanket, because there was another child coughing behind her already, and grief, her father had always said, was a debt that had to wait until the living were seen to. It was near dusk, with the fires burned low and Theodora's hands raw from washing and her voice gone hoarse from singing to frightened children, because she had nothing else to offer some of them but the sound of a calm voice, that she heard a horse coming hard down the ridge road, and looked up to see a rider she did not recognize pull up short at the edge of the camp. Staring at her the way a man stares at something he cannot quite believe. Isaac Garrison had not meant to come anywhere near the fever camp that evening. He had spent the day moving cattle down from the high pasture on his ranch 2 miles north of Willow Creek, and he had heard about the quarantine the same way everyone else had, second-hand, over supper, with his ranch hand Tobias shaking his head, and saying it was a hard thing, but the town had to protect itself. Isaac had agreed, because that was the sensible thing to say, and had gone to bed telling himself it was none of his business, but he had not been able to sleep. He kept seeing, whenever he closed his eyes, his younger sister Mary's face the way it had looked the winter he was 19, and she was 12, burning with a fever he had been too frightened to sit beside, because their mother had told him to keep his distance so the sickness would not spread to him too, and he had listened, and Mary had died with only their mother in the room, and Isaac had spent 14 years since then wondering if his sister had asked for him and been told he was not coming. So when he could not sleep, he saddled his horse and rode toward the creek, not entirely sure what he meant to do, and what he found there was a woman he did not know, alone among 30 sick and dying children, working by firelight as though she had not noticed the sun had gone down hours ago. "Ma'am," he said, swinging down from his horse, "you should not be out here without help." Theodora did not look up from the child she was tending, a boy struggling to breathe through swollen tissue in his throat. "I am aware of that," she said, "and yet here I am and here you are, so I suggest you make yourself useful instead of stating the obvious." He might have laughed in a different circumstance at the flatness of her tone. Instead, he found himself kneeling beside her without quite deciding to, and asking, "What do you need done?" She looked at him then, really looked, taking in the dust of the trail on his coat, the calluses on his hands, the steadiness in his eyes that told her he was not a man given to panic. "Water," she said, "boiled if you can manage a fire that will hold, and more wood before that fire dies altogether. After that, I will tell you what comes next." His name, he told her, was Isaac Garrison, and he ran cattle on land his father had claimed after the war, and he had no medical training whatsoever, but he had steady hands and had helped birth more calves than he could count, and he supposed a sick child could not be so very different from a sick animal in the ways that mattered most, which was to say, gently, and without flinching from what needed doing. Theodora almost smiled at that, the first almost smile of a very long night. "Mr. Garrison," she said, "if you can hold a child upright without dropping him and keep a fire burning until dawn, you will have done more good tonight than the entire town council of Willow Creek." He stayed. That was the whole of it in the end, the thing that would matter most in the years that followed. He stayed, when every voice of sense and self-preservation told him to ride home and forget he had ever seen the fever camp at all. They worked through the night together, strangers bent over the same small bodies, and by the time the sky began to lighten gray in the east, something had shifted between them that neither had words for yet, though both felt it. the particular closeness that comes from fighting the same losing battle side by side and refusing together to surrender. The days that followed fell into a brutal rhythm that Theodora would remember for the rest of her life in fragments, rather than whole scenes. The gray light of dawn over canvas tents, the particular sound of a child's cough that meant the membrane was closing, the taste of the willow bark tea she brewed for fevers until her hands smelled permanently of bitter herbs, the ache in her knees from kneeling on hard ground hour after hour, and always, Isaac Garrison somewhere nearby, hauling water, splitting wood, riding the 2 miles to his own ranch and back with whatever supplies he could spare or beg or, on one occasion, simply take from his own stores without asking anyone's leave. Sarah Voss, the orphan train's remaining escort, worked alongside them for the first 3 days before falling ill herself, a development that frightened Theodora badly, because Sarah was the only other adult who had shown any willingness to stay. Theodora nursed her through the worst of it in the same breath as she nursed the children, and Sarah survived, though weakened, and became, in her recovery, another set of hands for the lightest tasks. Word of what Theodora and Isaac were doing spread back to Willow Creek within the first 2 days, carried by the handful of townsfolk who rode out to the edge of the quarantine line to see for themselves whether the rumors were true. What they found was not reassuring to a fearful town. A woman and a cowboy, unrelated and unmarried, living openly at the fever camp, tending children the town had already grieved as lost. Some came away shamed. Others came away scandalized, more troubled by the impropriety of an unmarried woman keeping company with a man at all hours than by the fact that children were dying a mile from their own front porches. It was the town's preacher, Reverend Amos Halloway, who rode out on the 4th day to deliver both a warning and a rebuke. "Miss Bristol," he called from a careful distance, his horse skittish and unwilling to come nearer the camp than it had to, "the council asks that you return to town. What you are doing here, admirable as your intentions may be, cannot be permitted to continue." "The impropriety alone, the impropriety," Theodora said, straightening from the child she had been tending and fixing the Reverend with a look that made him sit back in his saddle, "is 30 children left to die because grown men were too frightened to bring them water. If you have come to discuss propriety, Reverend, I suggest you first explain to me how it is proper for a town to abandon its own." The Reverend had no answer for that, or none he was willing to give while looking into the faces of the children lying behind her, and he rode back to town with his warning undelivered, and though he would not have admitted it that day, his conscience considerably heavier than when he had arrived. Isaac watched the exchange from where he stood chopping wood at the edge of the camp, and when the Reverend's horse had disappeared back up the ridge road, he came to stand beside Theodora, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "You made an enemy there," he said. "I made an enemy the day I rode out here," Theodora answered. "I would rather have his enmity than his blessing, if his blessing requires me to leave these children to die quietly so the town can pretend it never happened." Isaac studied her profile for a long moment, the set of her jaw, the exhaustion carved into the lines around her eyes that no amount of resolve could hide. "My sister died of a fever when I was 19, he said, the words coming out before he had quite decided to speak them. "I was told to keep away so I would not catch it too. I listened. I have regretted it every day since." Theodora turned to look at him then, and something in her expression softened, not with pity, which he would not have wanted, but with understanding. "Then you know," she said quietly, "why I cannot leave." "I do," he said. "It is why I have not left either." They stood together in the cold morning air, 2 people who had each spent years carrying a private grief they had never spoken aloud to another living soul, and found in that moment that the weight of it was somehow lighter for having been shared. The days that followed brought small victories and terrible losses in a rhythm that gave Theodora no time to dwell on either. A boy named Peter, whose fever had broken on the 6th day, sat up for the first time and asked, in a rasping voice, whether he might have something to eat besides broth, and Theodora had laughed for the first time in a week, a sound that startled her as much as anyone, because she had forgotten laughter was still possible. A girl named Ruth, only 5 years old and traveling on the orphan train alone, because both her parents had died of the same fever back east that now threatened to take her too, slipped away in the night despite everything Theodora tried, and Theodora sat beside the small body until dawn, unable to make herself move, until Isaac came and gently took the child from her arms and told her, in a voice roughened by his own grief, that she had done everything a person could do, and that some children the fever simply would not release, no matter who fought for them. It was after Ruth's death that Isaac rode into Willow Creek against every piece of good sense he possessed, walked into the mercantile where the town council still met each evening to debate what should be done, and demanded, in a voice that carried through the thin walls to the street outside, that the quarantine line be moved back far enough to allow a proper burial ground, because he was tired, he said, of digging graves in frozen dirt at the camp's edge, while grown men sat warm in a back room, deciding whether the dead deserved dignity. The council, shamed into action by a man they had known for years as quiet and unremarkable, agreed to move the line and to send, at last, a wagon of supplies. Flour, blankets, and a case of medicine scavenged from Dr. Whitfield's own cabinet, since the doctor himself had, against expectation, begun to recover from his own bout with the fever, weakened but alive. It was not everything the camp needed, but it was more than nothing, and Theodora understood, watching the wagon creak down the ridge road toward the camp 2 days later, that Isaac Garrison had shamed an entire town into remembering itself, simply by refusing to let them forget what they had done. That night, with the new blankets distributed and the children fed better than they had been in a week, Theodora and Isaac sat together beside the largest fire, farther from the tents than usual, close enough to hear if a child cried out but far enough to speak without waking anyone. "You did not have to go into town today," Theodora said. "You could have been turned away, arrested even, for the way you spoke to them, from what Tobias told me when he brought the wagon." Isaac shrugged, though the gesture cost him more than he let show. "Someone had to say it," he said. "I kept thinking of Mary, how no one said it for her. How everyone just let her go quiet, like speaking up would have made it worse instead of better." He looked at Theodora across the firelight. "I did not want that to happen here, not while I could still do something to stop it." "You have done a great deal to stop it," Theodora said. "More than I could have managed alone, whatever the council might think of your methods." "I could not have managed any of it without you," Isaac said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, thick with something neither of them had named yet. "I rode out here that first night thinking I would help for an hour, maybe 2, and then go home and try to sleep. I have not thought about going home since." Theodora's breath caught just slightly at the plain honesty of that. She had spent the last week too exhausted, too consumed by the work in front of her, to notice how often her eyes sought him out across the camp, how the sound of his voice calming a frightened child had become, without her quite realizing it, one of the few things that steadied her own nerves. Now, in the quiet and the firelight, she allowed herself to notice. "Isaac," she said, using his given name for the first time, and felt him go still beside her at the sound of it. "I do not know what will happen when this is over. Whether these children will have anywhere to go, whether the town will ever forgive itself, whether I will ever sleep again without seeing Ruth's face. But I am glad, whatever else happens, that you did not ride home that first night." "So am I," he said, and reached over slowly to take her hand where it rested on the log between them, and she let him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else at all, because nothing else needed saying. The fever camp held 19 surviving children by the 10th day, down from the original 34, a ratio that would haunt Theodora for years, but that Dr. Whitfield, once he was strong enough to ride out and see the camp for himself, called nothing short of miraculous given the conditions she had been working under. I have seen diphtheria outbreaks in cities with proper hospitals lose more than that, the old doctor told her, sitting weakly on an overturned crate, while Theodora checked the wound where he had bled himself as a misguided treatment before falling ill. You have done in a tent camp with a bag of herbs what I could not have done in my own surgery, Miss Bristol. Your father would be proud beyond words. My father would ask why it took the whole town so long to send help, Theodora said, though she softened the words with a small, tired smile, because she did not truly blame the old man, who had fallen sick himself trying to help before anyone else had. Dr. Whitfield had no answer for that either, only a slow, ashamed nod, and he stayed on afterward to help where his strength allowed, a small penance that Theodora accepted without further comment, because there was too much work left to do to spend energy on old grievances. It was around this time, in the second week of the outbreak, that a new danger arrived at the camp's edge, one that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with fear. A group of 5 men from town, led by a hard-faced rancher named Cole Prescott who had lost no one to the sickness, but had grown convinced the camp was a danger to every homestead within riding distance, arrived at dusk with torches and talk of burning the tents to the ground, canvas and contents both, to end what they called the contagion once and for all. Theodora heard the horses first, then the raised voices, and stepped out from the medical tent to find Isaac already standing between the riders and the camp, his rifle not raised but held ready, his voice low and hard in a way she had not heard from him before. "There are children sleeping not 30 feet behind me," Isaac said. "You will not bring fire anywhere near this camp while I am standing here, Cole, and you know me well enough to know I mean it." "They are dying anyway, Garrison," Prescott called back, though his own horse shifted nervously beneath the torchlight, sensing perhaps what its rider could not quite admit, that this was not a fight he truly wanted. "Better it ends quick than spreads to every family in the valley. 19 of them are not dying," Theodora said, stepping up beside Isaac, her voice carrying clear and steady across the space between them and the riders. 19 of them are recovering, Mr. Prescott, because someone finally troubled themselves to care for them instead of standing at a safe distance deciding whether their lives were worth the risk. If you want to bring fire here, you will have to bring it through both of us first." The standoff held for a long, taut moment, torchlight flickering against the dark, until one of the other riders, a younger man Theodora recognized as the mercantile owner's son, lowered his torch and said quietly, "This is not right, Cole. My little cousin is in that camp. I am not setting fire to anything with her inside it." The younger man's defection seemed to break something in the group's resolve, and one by one the other riders lowered their torches, until only Prescott remained, glaring at Isaac with an anger that had nowhere left to go. "This is not over, Garrison," Prescott said, though the threat had lost most of its weight. "It is over tonight," Isaac said. "That is all that matters right now." The riders turned and left, torches guttering out one by one as they climbed back up the ridge road, and Theodora found her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining away all at once. Isaac caught her elbow before she could stumble, steadying her against his side. "You did not have to stand out there with me," he said, though the words came out gentler than his earlier tone toward Prescott. "That could have gone badly." "I was not about to let you face that alone," Theodora said. "We are past the point, I think, of facing anything here alone." He looked down at her, the torchlight from the departing riders still faintly visible on the ridge, and something in his expression made her heart trip in her chest. "No," he agreed softly. "I do not suppose we are." That night, unable to sleep after the confrontation, Theodora walked the perimeter of the camp checking on sleeping children, and found Isaac awake by the main fire, staring into the flames with the particular stillness of a man turning something difficult over in his mind. "You are thinking of Mary," she said, settling beside him without asking permission, a familiarity that had grown between them without either quite noticing when it had taken root. I am thinking that I almost failed her the same way Prescott wanted to fail these children, Isaac said. Not with fire, but with distance. I stayed away because I was told to, because it was easier than sitting with her and watching her suffer. I have told myself for 14 years that I had no choice. Standing out there tonight, I understood for the first time that I always had a choice. I simply made the wrong one once, and I have been trying to outrun it ever since. Theodora reached over and took his hand, the same gesture he had offered her days before, and felt him grip hers tightly in return. You did not fail these children, she said. Whatever happened with Mary, whatever you carry from it, you rode toward this fever instead of away from it. That is not a small thing, Isaac. That is, I think, the bravest thing I have ever seen a man do. He turned to look at her then, firelight catching the emotion in his eyes, and said, I think I have been waiting my whole life to hear someone say that and mean it. I mean it, Theodora said softly. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she did not, he kissed her, gently, there beside the dying fire with the sound of the creek running low behind them, and the camp finally quiet after the fear of the night's confrontation. It was not a kiss born of the desperation of the fever camp or the danger they had just faced, though both had surely played their part in bringing them to this moment. It was, both of them understood as they drew apart, a kiss born of something that had been growing quietly between them since the first night he had ridden down from the ridge and refused to leave. I have not thought of anything but you since the night I found you here, Isaac admitted, his voice low. I told myself it was foolishness, that this was no time to be thinking such things with children dying around us, but I cannot seem to stop. I have thought the same, Theodora confessed. I told myself it was exhaustion. That grief and fear can make a person feel closer to another than they truly are, but I do not think that is what this is, Isaac. No, he said, I do not think so either. They sat together until the fire burned to embers, talking in low voices of small things and large ones, of his ranch and her father, of the children sleeping nearby and the town that had so nearly failed them. And when Theodora finally rose to check the children once more before dawn, Isaac walked with her, and neither of them spoke of the moment again in the days that followed, though both carried it with them, a small warm certainty amid the exhausting work still ahead. The turning point came 12 days after Theodora had first ridden alone into the fever camp, when a boy named Daniel, only 8 years old, the same age Theodora's own younger brother had been when he died of a fever 19 years earlier, took a sudden turn for the worse in the middle of the night. Theodora had known Daniel's story since her first days at the camp. An orphan-trained child with no living family, quiet and watchful, who had taken to following her during her rounds and helping however small hands could help, fetching water, holding cloths, sitting with the sicker children so they would not be alone. She had grown fond of him in the particular way a physician was not supposed to grow fond of any single patient, and when Sarah Voss woke her before dawn with the news that Daniel's breathing had grown labored, and his lips had taken on the blue tinge that Theodora had learned, over these terrible weeks, to fear above all else, something in her chest seized with a dread that went beyond professional concern. His throat is closing, Theodora said, kneeling beside the boy and hearing the same fatal rattle she had heard in the very first child she had treated at this camp. I need Isaac, now. Isaac was there within moments, roused from his own restless sleep by the urgency in Sarah's voice, and found Theodora already attempting the only intervention she knew that might save a child whose airway had swollen nearly shut. A desperate procedure her father had once described to her, performed exactly twice in his career, in which a small incision was made low in the throat to allow air to pass below the obstruction. Her hands were steady, though her heart was not, and she talked herself through the procedure in a low murmur that Isaac would remember for the rest of his life, a recitation of everything her father had taught her, spoken aloud like a prayer to keep her own fear from overtaking her hands. Hold him still, she told Isaac. But gently, do you understand me, gently, He must not thrash while I do this." Isaac held the boy with the same careful strength he used calming a frightened calf, murmuring low reassurances even as his own face had gone pale in the firelight. And Theodora worked with a precision born of desperation and years of watching her father do the impossible with steady hands and a calm voice. The incision was small, the boy's cry when air finally passed through it thin and frightened, but crucially present. A sound that meant he was breathing, that meant he had not yet slipped past the point where breath itself was no longer possible. Theodora packed the wound with clean cloth, propped Daniel upright against a rolled blanket, and sat beside him through the remaining hours of darkness, one hand on his chest to feel the rise and fall of it, unwilling to trust her own ears to tell her he was still alive. Isaac stayed with her the entire time, saying nothing, simply present, his own hand resting on her shoulder in silent support. And when dawn finally broke gray over the mountains and Daniel's breathing had steadied into something less labored, less desperate, Theodora finally allowed herself to weep, not from grief this time, but from an exhaustion and relief so profound it left her shaking in Isaac's arms. "He is going to live," she said, the words half question, half plea for confirmation. "He is going to live," Isaac agreed, holding her, "because you would not let him die. I have never seen anything like what you did tonight, Theodora. I do not think I ever will again." Daniel's recovery, slow and hard one over the following days, became something of a turning point for the entire camp, a story that spread even back to Willow Creek and softened, in ways that Reverend Halloway's earlier rebuke had failed to, the town's collective conscience. The boy who had nearly died became, in the retelling, a symbol of everything Theodora and Isaac had accomplished against impossible odds, and the trickle of supplies and support from town, which had slowed to almost nothing after the initial wagon, began again, this time without needing to be shamed into existence. Reverend Halloway himself returned to the camp a week later, not with warnings this time, but with a wagon of donated blankets and food gathered from his congregation, and a request, offered with genuine humility, to hold a small service for the children who had not survived, that their deaths might not go entirely unmarked by the town that had failed to save them. Theodora agreed, and the small service held at the edge of the camp, beside the modest row of graves that Isaac had dug with his own hands over the preceding weeks, marked, in its quiet way, the town's first real acknowledgement of what its fear had cost. Reverend Halloway spoke of forgiveness and of the debt the living owed the dead, and though his words could not undo the harm already done, Theodora saw, in the faces of the townsfolk who had come, a genuine grief that had been absent in the earlier weeks of denial and distance. "It should not have taken this long," Theodora said quietly to Isaac afterward, watching the small crowd disperse back toward their wagons. "6 children are in that ground who might have lived if help had come sooner." "You are right," Isaac said. "It should not have taken this long, but it is here now and it will be here for whatever comes after this, and that has to count for something, even if it cannot undo what has already happened." Theodora nodded, though the grief of it sat heavy in her chest, a weight she suspected she would carry for the rest of her life, alongside every other loss her father's profession had taught her to carry without letting it break her. By the 3rd week, the fever had largely burned itself out, as such outbreaks eventually did, leaving behind 19 surviving children, weakened but recovering, and a camp that had transformed, almost without anyone quite noticing the change, from a place of dread into something closer to a makeshift home. The children who had recovered helped tend the ones still weak. Sarah Voss, fully recovered herself, had taken over much of the daily organization, feeding schedules and laundry, and the small routines that gave structure to what had been chaos. And Theodora and Isaac, though neither had spoken openly of what had grown between them beyond that single kiss weeks before, had settled into a partnership that neither could imagine unwinding, working side by side through each day with an ease that spoke of something far deeper than mere necessity. It was Sarah who finally raised the question that hung, unspoken, over the camp's slow recovery. What would become of the children once they were well enough to leave? Children who had been orphaned twice over now, first by whatever circumstance had put them on that train, and then by the fever that had taken any remaining family they might have had among the train's other passengers. Some have kin who rode ahead to towns further west, Sarah said, going through the train's battered manifest one evening as the three of them sat together near the main fire. Those we can send on, once they are strong enough to travel and someone can be found to accompany them. But there are 7 here, Miss Bristol, Mr. Garrison, who have no family waiting anywhere. Daniel among them. Theodora looked at Isaac across the fire, and found him already looking back at her, the same thought clearly moving behind his eyes that had begun forming in her own mind over the preceding days, ever since she had sat through that terrible night holding Daniel's chest beneath her palm, willing him to keep breathing. "I have more room on my ranch than I know what to do with," Isaac said slowly, as though testing the words aloud for the first time. "A house built for a family that never quite happened, since my sister passed, and my parents followed her within a few years. May God rest them. I have thought these last days that a house standing empty of children seems a waste, when there are children here with nowhere else to go." "You are speaking of taking them in," Theodora said, though it was not truly a question. "I am speaking of it," Isaac confirmed, "though I confess I have been imagining it as something we might do together if you would have it so. I do not think I could manage 7 children alone, and I do not think, after these 3 weeks, that I want to manage much of anything alone anymore, if you take my meaning." Theodora's breath caught, understanding clearly now what he was truly asking, even wrapped as it was in the practical language of housing and children. "Isaac Garrison," she said, "are you asking me to marry you in the middle of a fever camp, surrounded by children and covered in 3 weeks of dust and grief?" "I suppose I am," Isaac said, and had the grace to look faintly abashed at the circumstance even as his eyes held steady on hers. "It is not the proposal I would have imagined giving you, if I had ever imagined giving one to anyone at all, which I confess I had largely given up on before I rode down that ridge and found you kneeling over a sick child in the firelight. But I do not think I will find a better moment than this one, Theodora, because I do not think I will ever feel about anyone the way I have come to feel about you these past weeks. I love you. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it because of the circumstances we have shared, though I will always be grateful for whatever cruel twist of fate brought us together here. I say it because it is simply true, and I would like very much to spend the rest of my life proving it to you, if you will let me." Theodora felt tears rising, the same tears she had held back through weeks of grief and exhaustion, though these came from a very different source. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have loved you since that first night, when you knelt down beside me without being asked and simply started working, as though it had never occurred to you that there was any other choice to make. I would be glad to marry you, Isaac, and I would be gladder still to raise these children with you, all of them, if that is truly what you want." "It is exactly what I want," Isaac said, and reached for her hands across the fire, and Sarah Voss, watching the exchange with a small, satisfied smile, quietly excused herself to check on the children, leaving the 2 of them alone with the fire and the wide, dark sky and a future that had, only weeks before, seemed impossible to imagine. The formal end of the quarantine came a few days later, when Dr. Whitfield, fully recovered and restored to his position of authority in Willow Creek, declared the fever camp safe and the surviving children free to be brought back into town for proper housing, while arrangements were made for those with family elsewhere. The town, chastened by weeks of watching its own cowardice exposed against Theodora and Isaac's steady courage, turned out in surprising numbers to help with the transition, offering spare rooms, donated clothing, and an outpouring of guilty generosity that Theodora accepted graciously, though she never quite forgot how absent all of it had been when it was needed most. Cole Prescott, notably, did not participate in any of the town's belated charity, and left Willow Creek entirely within the month, unable, it was said, to bear the weight of his neighbors' altered opinion of him after the night he had ridden to the camp with torches. Theodora felt no satisfaction in his departure, only a quiet relief that his fear had not, in the end, been allowed to cause the harm he intended. The 7 children without family, Daniel among them, moved to Isaac's ranch in the weeks that followed, along with Theodora, who took up residence in the house's spare rooms until a wedding could be properly arranged, a matter of propriety that Reverend Halloway, eager now to make amends in whatever small way he could, insisted on overseeing personally and without delay. The wedding took place on a clear October morning, 6 weeks after Theodora had first ridden alone into the fever camp, in the yard of Isaac's ranch house, with the mountains standing gold and red in the autumn light behind them. It was a small affair, attended by Sarah Voss, who had decided to stay on in Willow Creek rather than continue west with what remained of the orphan train's original mission, by Dr. Whitfield, weakened still but insistent on attending, by Tobias and the other ranch hands, and by all 7 of the children who now called the ranch home, dressed in their best donated clothes and watching the ceremony with the particular solemn wonder of children who had recently learned, in the hardest way possible, not to take any happy occasion for granted. Daniel, fully recovered though a faint scar remained at the base of his throat where Theodora's desperate incision had saved his life, stood at the front of the small gathering, and when Reverend Halloway asked if anyone objected to the union, called out instead, in his clear boy's voice, "I think they should hurry up and get married, because Miss Theodora promised she would teach me to read properly once she was not so busy, and I have been waiting 3 weeks already." The small gathering laughed, and even Reverend Halloway smiled, and Theodora, looking at Isaac across the small distance that remained between them, felt a happiness so complete it nearly stole the breath from her lungs, a feeling utterly unlike the desperate breathlessness of the fever camp's worst nights, but no less powerful for the difference. "I promise," Isaac said, when it came time for his vows, "that I will never again let fear keep me from standing beside the people I love, whatever the cost of standing there might be. I promise to work beside you, Theodora, in whatever fights come our way, and to trust that together we are stronger than anything that might try to separate us. I promise to love you and to love every child we raise together, for as long as I am given breath to do it." Theodora, when her turn came, found her voice steadier than she expected, though her heart raced with an emotion too large for words to fully hold. "I promise," she said, "that I will always ride toward whatever needs saving, and that I will be glad for the rest of my life that I do not have to ride alone anymore. I promise to love you, Isaac Garrison, exactly as fiercely as you loved these children when the rest of the world had turned away from them, because that fierceness is the truest measure of your heart that I have ever seen in any person, and I intend to spend my life grateful for it." They were married before noon, and the small gathering celebrated with a meal cooked by the ranch hands and a fiddle borrowed from town, and the 7 children who had survived the fever camp danced clumsily in the yard with an energy that would have seemed impossible only weeks before, when most of them had been too weak to sit upright. That night, after the celebration had wound down and the children had finally been coaxed to their beds, Theodora and Isaac stood together on the porch of the ranch house, looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the star-filled sky. "I never imagined my life taking this shape," Theodora said softly. "A husband, 7 children all at once, a ranch instead of a medical practice in town. If you had told me 2 months ago this is where I would be standing, I would not have believed you." "Nor would I," Isaac admitted. "I had resigned myself to a quiet life alone with my cattle and my regrets." I am glad, more than I can properly say, that a fever camp changed both our plans so thoroughly. As am I, Theodora said, leaning into his side as his arm came around her shoulders. Though I hope, for the sake of our nerves, that our next adventure together involves rather less fever. Isaac laughed, a warm sound that had become, over these past weeks, one of Theodora's favorite sounds in the world. I will do my best to arrange a quieter life from here forward, he said. Though I suspect, with 7 children in the house, quiet may be too much to hope for. The years that followed bore that prediction out, though not unhappily. The ranch grew busier and louder with each passing season, filled with the ordinary chaos of children growing up. Skinned knees and schoolwork, chores done grudgingly, and adventures undertaken without permission. The particular music of a house that had once stood too quiet and now rang constantly with voices. Daniel, true to his word, learned to read under Theodora's patient instruction and grew into a serious, thoughtful young man who eventually apprenticed himself to the new doctor, who came to replace the aging doctor. Whitfield drawn, he said, by memories of a night he barely remembered except for the sound of Theodora's calm voice talking herself through a desperate procedure that had saved his life. 2 years after the wedding, Theodora gave birth to a son, whom they named Elias after her father, a boy with Isaac's steady dark eyes, and from an early age, his mother's fierce insistence on fairness in all things. 3 years after that came a daughter, Mary, named for the sister Isaac had lost so many years before, a naming that brought tears to Isaac's eyes when Theodora first suggested it, and a healing of sorts that he had not known he still needed until it was offered to him. The town of Willow Creek changed too, in the years that followed, though slowly and imperfectly, as towns tend to do. A proper hospital was built, funded in part by donations that Theodora, ever practical, insisted on soliciting from every family who had turned their backs on the fever camp, framing the requests not as accusation but as opportunity, a chance to build something that would ensure no child would ever again be left to die simply because the adults around them were too afraid to help. Reverend Halloway, in his sermons, made a point each year on the anniversary of the quarantine's end to speak of the debt the town owed to courage over fear. A small but persistent reminder that Theodora suspected had done more to soften the town's collective heart than any single grand gesture could have managed. Sarah Voss married Dr. Whitfield's young assistant 2 years after the fever camp closed, and the two of them eventually took over the new hospital's daily operations, remaining close friends with Theodora and Isaac for the rest of their lives, bound together permanently by the shared memory of what they had survived and accomplished together. On quiet evenings, once the younger children were asleep, and the older ones had settled into their own rooms with books or chores, Theodora and Isaac would often sit together on the same porch where they had spoken their wedding vows, watching the same mountains turn gold, and then purple and then dark, and speak of the fever camp not with the grief that had once made the memory unbearable, but with a hard-won gratitude for everything it had ultimately given them. "I think of Ruth sometimes," Theodora said one such evening, years after the fact, when Elias was already off to school in Denver and Mary had grown nearly old enough to follow him. "And the others we lost. I do not think that grief ever fully leaves a person." "No," Isaac agreed, his arm around her shoulders as it had been on so many evenings before. "But I think we have honored them in the years since by making sure their loss meant something, by making sure the children who lived had somewhere to belong, and by making sure this town never again lets fear decide who deserves saving and who does not." "I could not have done any of it without you," Theodora said, echoing words she had said to him once before in the desperate early days of the fever camp, though now the words carried none of that earlier desperation, only a deep and settled certainty. "I rode out to that camp alone, Isaac, prepared to face it by myself if I had to. I am endlessly grateful I did not have to." "You would have managed, I have no doubt," Isaac said. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Theodora Bristol Garrison, but I am glad, every single day, that I did not have to find out how you would have managed alone. I am glad I rode down that ridge instead of turning back toward home." "So am I," Theodora said, and kissed him softly there on the porch, with their children asleep inside and the mountains standing dark and steady around them. The same mountains that had watched over a desperate fever camp years before, now watching over a family built from that same desperation, transformed, through courage and love, into something whole and lasting and entirely their own. They lived out the remainder of their lives on that ranch, watching their children and eventually their grandchildren grow up beneath the same wide Colorado sky. And Theodora never once regretted the choice she had made that cold autumn morning, to saddle her father's gray mare and ride alone toward a fever camp that everyone else had already abandoned, because it was that choice, more than any other in her long and eventful life, that had brought her to Isaac Garrison, and to the family they had built together from the wreckage of a tragedy that neither of them had asked for, but both of them had faced with a courage that, in the end, had proven stronger than any fever, any fear, or any distance the world had tried to put between them.